because of kind of how much consumption you could show. You know, you want it to look good because you're promoting the idea of the Soviet Union. There are more limited, but nonetheless legitimate sort of consumer opportunities. At the same time, when people are really living in poverty, especially TV reaches everywhere, including rural areas, you can't make it look too good. So any kind of sitcom or soap opera that's set in the home, there are very few of those. There are a couple that they made for television in the 70s, but they're limited and they're very interesting. And that kind of serial time frame, it never became quite as intensely tied to the rhythm of the day. Holidays are more important there in organizing the schedule than they are. They're important here too, but they're very important there. And weeks of broadcasting to go along with the holiday calendar, including kind of more popular entertainments at holiday time. So there are kind of, you can come together these things. And in terms of, you know, content that's, they are very aware of this now. Former television workers who I interviewed talk constantly about children's broadcasting. That is their primary thing, is that their children's broadcasting was truly enlightening, innocent, charming, nonviolent. And it's kind of true. I mean, I show my kids Soviet cartoons from the 60s and 70s because they're very sweet. And they don't have any violence, and they have a lot of adorable tiny animals, no big angry dinosaurs, you know what I mean? There's something to that. So anyway, their children's broadcasting is one thing. But I think this kind of Cold War context, so much of what 60s and 70s Soviet popular culture was about was showing the Soviet way of life that was kind of materially bountiful, but not as bountiful as the West, but it made up for it in these kind of moral ways. They emphasized friendship and kind of warm family ties and all these kind of moral superiority and a kind of tasteful Soviet consumption that was less bounteous, but more cultured than the West. So it's still very bound up in consumption to some extent. I'm always resistant to finding Soviet television. On the one hand, I find it very appealing. On the other hand, I resist that appealingness because, A, of what you know about Soviet Union, but B, because of, it's really an intellectual-centered thing, right? It's the dream of an enlightening television system where intellectuals are number one and appear on TV. And this is not necessarily what was realized, but what these guys wanted. And some of it was realized. So I think it looks a lot, Soviet television looks in a lot of ways like state-owned broadcasting in Europe, right? It's enlightening. It shows a lot of opera, a lot of ballet, a lot of stuff like that that's not necessarily connected to Soviet ideology, except indirectly as a form of enlightening the masses in some way, but is nonetheless, you can argue Shakespeare is just as entertaining as anything else, right, if you have enough education to appreciate it. But it is kind of high culture, is the predominant thing, sports. But it's not, I always have some tension about kind of, in any way, idealizing it as a kind of, especially because of the Cold War really makes it more similar, I think, to U.S. broadcasting and European broadcasting than the more visionary utopian stuff of the earlier period to some extent. They did have cool documentary stuff that they wanted to do, and you can imagine it being amazing, but it was partly amazing in the context of never being able to see that kind of spontaneous broadcasting or everyday life on the streets or whatever. When they did realize it was partly amazing, not just because that stuff is amazing, but because they never saw things like that, so it was particularly unusual. It's a long answer, I realize, but I think it looked basically a lot like European, like PBS or something, without the insightful political documentaries. But Stephen.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting that you raised this issue of show your kids, show Lydia the 60s and 70s. So my question is actually about how is Soviet television from that era, from the 60s and 70s, presented to a modern audience? To what degree is it still on YouTube? Is it still talked about? Is there nostalgia? Is there a reaction against it because of the transition to post-communism? How is, in contrast or in similarity to the Western context, how is the contemporary, how is the television you're talking about consumed by modern audiences in Russia?
Yeah, that's an important question, and that's part of what caused me to take up this topic, is that they're, even more than we watch vintage television and talk about it and have documentaries about it, it is the topic. It is the way of remembering the Soviet past, partly because so much of sort of Soviet state ceremonial in the last couple of decades was on TV, and that's how you experienced it, right? Especially if you didn't live in the capital, you would see these parades and all that on television. So this televisual memory of it is the kind of main way that is remembered, and these shows are very much the center. I have this DVD collection because bookstores in Brighton Beach will sell it to the immigrant population here, right? This game show. These shows there's a whole channel called the Nostalgia Channel where you can watch, much like RTV, but nonetheless more significant there maybe. or significant in a different way, where this state and this ideology are gone. But yeah, it's very, very popular. They're mostly looked back on fondly. The thing is, again, to some extent today I was talking about the most interesting and innovative and beloved shows, these kind of more innovative shows that have become part of the official memory of this time and this television as very creative and interesting. There was a lot of, terrible, whatever, very boring propaganda that was also informed by these same ideas, sort of terrible, long, lengthy documentaries, with one farmer and the camera lovingly gazes into his face, and he too is supposed to be exposed and cause a spiritual conversion process in the viewer through encountering him, but it was much less successful, as viewer letters kind of indicate, that they found this boring, and indeed, and TV workers themselves also did not like making this, and the people who made that stuff got paid less, and the people who made this stuff, this kind of game show, those were the prestigious guys, kind of the grunts who made the clear propaganda. But at the same time, same kind of intellectual heritage. And that stuff, too, is on this Nostalgia channel, kind of usually not in full length or whatever. But they do show that, and that's part of the memory, too. So you have kind of the whole array of memory of this period as both boring and stultifying, and then also vibrant and warm and youthful and kind of nostalgic, all kind of captured in this TV. But these shows in particular are fondly remembered as something that's better than what they have now. Some of them are still on, so they're not gone, but in any case. Yeah, but it's the center of post-Soviet nostalgia, as it is in East Germany too, I think, and other places. Oh, sorry.
I'm aware that since the dismantling of the Soviet Union, and particularly in the last few years, there's sort of been an inundation on Russian television of American primetime sitcoms adapted and reproduced for a Russian audience. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that and how that may relate to your research.
Yeah, that's definitely true, and that's part of, I think, maybe increases what Steve's talking about, the kind of nostalgia for the authentic Russian Soviet stuff that is, was truly theirs, whereas there's so much, there's a whole critique of this kind of dumping practice where these shows taped in the U.S. are sold cheap abroad. This is done everywhere, making it difficult to compete with the production values and all of that, because they're sold at much less than the cost of producing such a show. Russians have also started to make Russian versions based on the scripts or whatever. I even had a friend who was got the greatest job ever, which is to watch Seinfeld with a Russian television executive to help kind of convey the humor to him and translate it for him to see if they could make a Russian version of Seinfeld, whether it was possible. But they have, Who's the Boss, and all kinds of things have been rewritten for Russian characters set in the present. So there is this kind of, whatever you want to call it, partly nationalist, partly nostalgic rejection of this influx of stuff. On the other hand, these shows are very popular, as they are in many other places. And they have been kind of Russianized by these Russian casting versions where they use the script but recast it with Russian actors and do it all in Russian without dubbing. And that makes it less conspicuous, but nonetheless people kind of know. I mean, they did a Russian version of Married with Children with, when they still had that staircase. Those of you who've seen that show, the staircase in the background where it's like a two-story house. And of course, no Russians actually live in a two-story house, or very few. Most people live in apartments or small wooden houses that don't have two stories that way. And so anyway, it's very strange that they maintain that aspect of the set. So you can sort of visually tell when things are imported in these ways, even when they recast it and refilmed it. I'm just entertaining with anecdotes now. But I think that is an important part of this memory of the Soviet Union. And the way these shows are now presented in digital media, right? You can watch them on the internet. All the BitTorrent sites have them and that kind of thing.
What is the impact of that in terms of commercialization, in terms of consumption, as you were talking about earlier? That you're talking tension there, trying to do the soaps, not being able to do the soaps. And well, now they're dumping, as it were, dumping product. The product show itself and the impact you mentioned. What is that? How is that had an impact on, say, Soviet society broadly?
Yeah, Russian society. I mean, I do think there's, obviously, despite the continued kind of resonance of these ideas about, the transcendent power of media to remake, or Russia's role in general as a place where Europe can be superseded, or they can do things better because they were behind or different or whatever, they really